and welcome to Junior, a Senior, and I. I'm really excited about this episode and the guests today. Today, we're going to talk about tests and RSpec. And for that, I am joined by Steven and Philippe. Steven, could you introduce yourself in 3 sentences or less, please?
Sure. I'm Steven. Oh, there's one. I've been developing software for almost 30 years professionally, and I mostly try to work in Ruby when I can. And yeah, that's me.
Cool, thanks. And what about you, Philippe?
Hi, I'm Philippe. I've been developing for 15 years, mostly in Ruby, mostly in web. But since 4 or 5 years ago, I've also started doing management, and I'm currently the CTO of NodalView.
Thank you. And the first question is an obvious one. Why are tests important? Whomever of you wants to take it up first.
I'm gonna try starting. Why are tests important? Because they increase the confidence you have about the fact that the code does what you think it does. So that's the whole point, because the code never does exactly what nobody thinks it does. But with tests, you have a better understanding and you have a better confidence about your understanding of what it does.
Yeah, I would echo that. For me, it's all about confidence. The confidence to add new features, the confidence to make changes, the confidence to remove old code. I absolutely agree with that. For me, it's always test first or TDD. And I always like to think of it in terms of describing the behavior that the software will have when it's done. And so the tests also serve as almost documentation for how the code works. And that's also valuable.
I do agree with both of you, but one of the fallbacks that I usually have, and I think that's how I got in contact with Steven actually, is that all the code bases I've seen have tests that run for a long time. Like my current test suite is parallelized in 10 different processes and it runs for about 10-ish minutes, 15-ish minutes. And that's a long time, right? So I can basically only run them when I'm ready to merge my code. So how do you try to keep them fast, or is it something that's normal?
It is normal. That doesn't mean that it's good or necessary, but it is very normal. There are a whole bunch of different things that you can do to solve these problems, but a number of starting points. First of all, if the tests are slow, it sometimes means the actual code is slow. And so that's a place that's worth checking out. There are a whole bunch of tricks, and I think this is how we actually came across each other on Twitter, because there were a whole bunch of people suggesting the tricks that I hate. Things like, oh, use Spring to preload your environment and parallelize and do this. And in my opinion, you do those things, you're only allowed to do those things after you've done everything else. Those are the things that you get to make a good situation better. But if you start there, you're just making a bad situation slightly less bad. A lot of the test overhead comes from poor dependency management. And so I would look first at dependencies. I would look first at what kinds of things are we interacting with that are slow. Databases, third-party APIs, complex calculations, and then you use methods like mocking and stubbing is very common for this kind of stuff, and other kinds of fakes for speeding up a test suite. I want an entire test suite, including acceptance tests. My personal benchmark for that is I want it to run in definitely less than 20 minutes, preferably less than 10. And that includes all of the acceptance tests and everything. I want my unit tests, though, to run in less than about 4 seconds. And ideally even less than that. But I want my unit tests to run so fast that I just run them every time I'm having an idle thought.
I'm gonna challenge you on that. That's what you want? Is it something that you manage to do often enough to say it's realistic?
Yes. My unit tests are almost always that fast. I will say, on projects where I have the ability to influence the direction that things go in. When I join a team late in the game that's already started, or if I've got a team that likes to argue with me about how to do shit, then it's not necessarily going to be true. But while Philippe is giving his opinion on test speed, I'm going to let you know what my test suite looks like on my current main project.
Okay, I'm less extreme. So I'm perfectly okay with like test suite taking like whole time up to 10 minutes, because the moments I need to run my whole test suite is because I want to deploy. So 10 minutes is acceptable for me. I typically do parallelization, but it's not an advice I would do. So I do something that I'm not proud of. And the thing is, I believe I made comfort choices instead of disciplined choices. So I typically use factories, building whole graphs of objects when I only like need one of them. I typically persist stuff in database just because it's easy for me to like query the database, but I don't need persistence. Like it would have been fine in memory for most of them. I visit a page with like full JavaScript blown when I only need to transit via that page to click on a link. So JavaScript was absolutely useless, etc., etc., etc. So I made my peace with all those stuff. I know I could improve that if time was a problem, but on the other hand, time is not yet a problem. So I'm very much most of the time in a situation that everything has an opportunity cost. And the big question is, how do I use my next hour? How do I use my next day? And I haven't been very disciplined from the start. So this is the question I need to ask. Will I use my next day, my next month to improve that test? And I'm investing because I'm going to get some wealth back from that. Or do I invest in developing a new feature, documenting something, doing something else, basically?
Yeah, I like that approach. When I find pain points, I tend to adopt the Boy Scout rule on that, which is just leave it cleaner than you found it. And so when there's one piece that's really pissing me off, then I go and work on that. So on my main project that I work on myself, and it's for online music lessons, the entire test suite, not including the system tests, runs in 3.5 seconds. I haven't really tuned it yet. And the system tests run in 9 seconds, and I have very good coverage across everything here. And because I just ported it, I started it out on RSpec, and then I realized I didn't like it, so I'm starting to get rid of RSpec. And I just checked out and ran the same test suite that I had ported from RSpec, and in RSpec it takes 6.8 seconds. And then Cucumber took 24 seconds, I think. So yeah, so RSpec used to be faster than test unit, but now it's slower by quite a lot. But yeah, I do 4 seconds for an entire test suite run is really important for me. But I never want a single file to take longer than about 150 milliseconds. Because more than 150 milliseconds and I get distracted and start playing video games.
Whereas I'm quite happy when I see that a file takes less than a second on my end.
Yeah, that's typical.
But I think if you have like such fast tests, it enables you to approach developing in a new way. Like if you have tests that takes 1 second, then you can do development in a certain way. If you have tests that takes 5 seconds, it's a different way. If it's 10 minutes, it's a different way again. And I like the fact that the Boy Scout rule, and for me, it's also paired with like, I'm doing annoyance-driven development. So I typically do stuff because I need to, and then there's a part of my time which is dedicated to getting less annoyed by stuff. And sometimes what I believe is annoying is different than other times.
Yeah, when I focus on having my ideal workflow is basically only enabled by having a super fast test suite. And I don't remember what the setup is because I haven't ported it to my new machine. But my Emacs setup, which I'm still working on porting over, Emacs is set up so that when I edit a piece of code, it uses projectile and robe to figure out which tests are likely to be affected. And then it runs just those tests every time I save the file. And so on save, it runs the tests. And then if the tests fail and then pass again, like if they fail, it'll run on save, on save, on save. And then once they pass again, it then runs the entire suite in the background. And I really, really like that workflow. And when your individual test runs in 150 milliseconds, you can absolutely... This is why I don't give a shit about type checkers and static typing, because my unit test runs faster than the damn compiler does.
Small question. Are you using Rails?
Yeah.
Okay. Because I'm thinking maybe with the like all the speeds you're given, it would change things. Like if you're using Hanami or something else, like it might change some things. And I know that most Rails projects that I've been involved in, typically if you start your RSpec test with spec helper or Rails helper or something in between, like database helper, that changes a lot. You haven't yet started a single test, but you've already like spent 10 seconds just because you have 3,000 gems and 50 initializers.
Yeah, so in Emacs, Robe solves that. I just started using Robe like the other day. I had like a massively custom setup before that in Emacs, and for a while then I stopped using it and used RubyMine anyways. But if you have control of your environment, then what you can do is the way Robe works is really cool. It boots your application in Pry. And so the application's already running. And so when you run a test, it just injects the test into the live environment that's already running.
It's funny because on one hand you say you don't like Spring, but then you're describing is very similar to Spring or Zeus or stuff like that.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. But it's not that I don't like Spring or any of those things. It's that I want people to lean on those after they already have a fast test suite. I don't want you to make every bad decision in the world and then throw Spring on top, because that's just, that's putting lipstick on a pig, right? But by having the live environment running, you can save some of that warm-up time. The warm-up time is brutal.
I think I tried to use something similar in the past. I believe the name of the gem was Guard, but I'm not sure. And it would say, like, if you had a model and you had a model spec, it will run the specs of that model and save. But again, a bit like what you said, my model was so slow that it didn't make a difference. Like, yeah, it will run in 4 seconds instead of 6, but like at that point, do I even care about those 2 seconds that I gain? Because I cannot run it every time I save, right? I cannot wait 4 seconds for every save.
Yeah, and how many frigging Rails projects today are 12 Docker containers and, oh, I've just edited this file, now I need to rebuild the Docker container and all that, like, oh my god, the feedback loop on modern Rails projects is so slow. Like, you can go golfing in between changes, like minor changes. It's absolutely brutal. And that's on most projects too. Like, back when I was a consultant, I would get brought into people were paying me like $250, $350 an hour sometimes to sit and wait for their fucking test suite to run.
Do they hire?
I had a client one time that absolutely refused to allow me to spend time speeding up the test suite. This is going back probably 5 or 6 years now. And absolutely refused to let me speed up the test suite. So I itemized on their bill how much they had paid me to sit and wait for tests to run. And they had paid me thousands of dollars that week to sit and wait for tests to run, like several $1,000s. Then they paid for speeding up the test suite.
Plus the disruption, because I think part of I'm very patient in general, but the thing is, if I have to wait 1 second, 2 seconds, I'm still in the flow, like my thoughts are still in the same area. If I have to wait 15, 20 seconds, I'm skipping to something new. And that context switch has a huge cost.
Exactly. When you've got a long feedback loop on your test suite, you are breaking flow, you've got a context switch, and if you have other things pulling at your attention, especially if my kids are basically grown now and only one lives at home, but so I don't have kids drawing my attention away. But if my kids were younger, they might be distracting me, find a good opportunity to distract me. Just playing a video game. Like, I will stop and play a video game if I'm waiting for a long build or something. And if these test runs are long, I'm going to go and play a video game. And I don't know about you, but when I boot up Factorio for 30 minutes, that like 6 hours passes on the clock pretty quickly.
Yeah. It brings me to, Philippe, you were saying you have patience for a lot of things, but you have that context switch. Since your test suite is, I'm going to say, orders of magnitude slower than the benchmark that Steven sets himself, how do you try to have still a productive feedback loop? Do you run less tests, or is it you run less times the tests? Or how do you validate that you're building the correct thing, even though you have a longer feedback loop?
For starters, I do not run all the tests all the time. I'm typically focusing on one thread of tests, so one of each. But even if I have like a pyramid of tests, if I'm currently, like most of the time, I'm currently at the unit level. So I'm currently running the specific test, like one test, which I just wrote because there's an additional case that I want to handle, right? So this is how TDD works. I'm just testing that it works the 29th of February. So this is a very specific test. And this is the only one I need to run, because when that one gets green, then I get to test maybe the full context or maybe the full unit test. And if that one is green, then most of the time I actually have my next, it's written already. Like I use RSpec, right? I'm writing all my it when I'm thinking about all the cases, but I'm not writing the block. I'm not writing the do end. I'm like, okay, it does this and it does that and it does that and it does that. And then as soon as I have written one of them is green, I go for the do end of the next one and then the next one and then the next one. So this is my usual flow, and I don't mind if it takes maybe 1 second to beat. So yeah, I'm orders of magnitude slower, but I would prefer saying that he is orders of magnitude faster, because waiting 1 second is still very acceptable. Again, for my loop. Now the big question is my process the consequence of my slow test, or is it the other way around? I don't know which is cause and which is consequence. Like definitely the two goes together.
I know that in my case, I have quite a similar process than you, because same thing, right? Like a test takes a second or a second-ish, but if I have to run the entire test suite, I can go have a coffee and a dinner and lunch, probably. But that does make it so that I can run only one test. Like I choose the moments where I run the whole tests wisely, quote unquote, and I run them less than I would want. And so I know that in my case, it is the tests are dictating my flow instead of I'm dictating my tests, or my flow is dictating my tests. But it leads me to a question that I think will have a different answer from both of you, which I'm enjoying because I think it's the first time where two guests have valid and different opinions and can discuss about them. What is for you an efficient test suite?
Is it in terms of speed?
I'm voluntarily not defining efficient because there is where I think the disagreement will happen.
Okay. So if the point of the test is getting confidence that your code is doing what you think it does, an efficient test suite is, for starters, it's accurate. So when it says it works, it actually works. And if it's efficient, it means it's giving me a good compromise of a good answer fast enough so that I can do the stuff for which I'm currently needing confidence, which most of the time is deploying. But it could be other stuff. So most of the time, I need that confidence because I want to deploy. So an efficient test suite allows me to deploy more frequently and in a stable way, like have a higher proportion of successful deploys.
I would agree with that. And I would say that for me, the efficiency comes out in the failures. So when I get a test failure, ideally, I want only one test to fail. And I want the failure to shine a spotlight on exactly where the error is. Now, usually you'll get a cluster of test failures, especially if you have a model test in a Rails app that's failing. There will usually be one or two tests around the line where the bug is. And then there will be probably two or three, maybe more controller tests that also interact with that. But for me, the efficiency comes from when I get that first failure, or when I get a failure, how quickly can I pinpoint the line that the actual bug is on? And that's really important to me. It would be nice for me to be able to say, here are all the things you can do to make sure that you have this, but it varies by project and it varies by person, and it's just really nice when it happens.
I'm gonna put a little pin on the cluster term that you just threw to share an anecdote that Philippe told me once, if you don't mind, Philippe, that you like to try to guess what the failure of the next test would be.
Yeah, so this is my typical loop is whenever I'm hitting that run test button, I play the game of I believe the failure, because most of the time it's failing, right? I believe the failure is going to be this. And then I get reinforced. Either I'm right, so I'm positively reinforced, my confidence in my understanding of the test and the code rises, or I'm wrong, and then I learn something, etc., etc. So yeah, this is typically my loop when doing TDD.
Which goes again, I believe, in what Stephen is saying of the test should be predictable, right? An efficient test should be predictable, and part of it fails this way is that predictability. I know what I'm testing, right?
Yeah, the practice that Philippe is describing, I learned about it in XP, and we say call your shot. And so if I'm pairing I will say, okay, we're going to run the test and it's going to fail right here, and here's why. And I'll expect my pair to do the same thing. And the reason I want this is because I'm demonstrating to myself, like Philippe said, I'm demonstrating to myself that I know how this, what the fuck I just did and why. Like, for me, there's being right. It's not enough to have the correct answer. You also have to have arrived at that correct answer in a predictable way. And this comes up periodically in, actually, this has happened more than once with my wife, where she says, oh, I knew that was going to happen. I told you that I thought X was going to happen. And I would say, yeah, sure, you said some random words and you made a prediction, but you didn't have enough information to actually make that prediction. You were just guessing and got lucky. Guessing and getting lucky is not valuable knowledge. And you can imagine that she was very happy to have this education from me. But it's super important to not only have the understanding, but also have built up that understanding from a foundation of good understanding so that you can be more predictable in the future. Yeah, so it's a super important practice, I think.
And you mentioned pairing. I think it shows when you do pairing, because when you're alone in your head, you're like, yeah, it's going to fail. Like you're skipping, you don't even realize you're skipping. When you have to tell someone, you're like, okay, it will fail that for this reason. And then you have to verbalize it. And then you have to really ground your understanding, because there's nowhere to hide. You're like, yeah, it's going to fail because that class is, how can I explain that? And when you're hitting that spot, how can I explain that? You're really getting something. And this is what prevents you from getting afraid of your code. And it happens like very often. People are afraid of the code. You're like, we should make a change in this part of the code base. And the whole team is like, can we not? Maybe we don't like going there. We're afraid. Okay, you don't like, it's an old part of the code. What is the estimate? Okay, let's not argue. Let's imagine that estimate is an acceptable process. And everybody's like, 6 months. And it makes no sense, of course. And this is also why you should not ask for estimates. But it shows something like people are afraid of the code. It's very emotional. It's a lack of understanding. When you're doing pair programming and you explain it's going to fail at that for this reason, you really ground your understanding and your confidence in your code. And then your partner is doing the same.
Is that something that, according to you both, anyone should do? Like, is it something that should be quote unquote standard, knowing that preferences, etc., etc.? But is it something that should be standard in anyone's code process or code loop or however you want to call it?
I think if you're doing TDD, then yes. I would not advise doing pairing 100% of the time, even though I am open to it, like anybody who wants to try in my team, more than happy that they try. But I have tried and it's fucking exhausting. So at some point I wanted a balance of comfort, because it's very uncomfortable verbalizing all your thought. You have to slow down because you cannot speak at the speed you're thinking. But there's benefits in slowing down your train of thought. So yeah, me personally, I would not pair all the time, but I would pair a lot.
I was referring more to the calling your shot practice.
Yeah, if you're doing TDD, it's part of TDD. Otherwise, what are you doing?
Yeah, and also it's cheap. Like, it's a practice that's nearly free. It's so easy. It's fun. It's a bit of a game. It increases your confidence. Like, there's literally no downside to it because it's just such an easy thing. So I would say call your shot is an excellent one. Even though it's not what you asked about, but since Philippe talked about pair programming, I did want to jump in there because I agree that pair programming is exhausting and I hate it. And I also prefer to pair. I hate every minute of it. I get behind on my podcasts. I get behind on album releases. I don't listen to as much music, but I still prefer to pair. Actually, I prefer to mob. I prefer the whole team in one room. And it's really magical when that works. That said, you need a team where everyone is on board, where everyone is bought in. On my current team right now, people hate to pair. I will write in Slack, hey, I'd like a pair on this because I'm experiencing this. And I get back very quickly. My team is awesome. I love the people on my team, But when I say I would like a pair, usually the answer I get is 2 links to a wiki and maybe a couple of old pull requests. It's like, and I'm thinking, did you just tell me to go fuck myself? I said I would like a pair. But on one of my current teams, people just really do not like to pair.
Do you know why?
I don't know why. If I had to assume based on what I know of the team and the individuals, I think it's just a lack of practice. On this particular team, I've been there for like 8 months. The next newest person on the team has been on that team for like 7 years. And they've never really paired until I showed up.
So they have preconceived idea of what is pair, and maybe they don't like that preconceived idea. Now back to the topic at hand, I think it's very similar to test. Actually, people don't like it because they have no practice, because it shows vulnerabilities in your own aptitudes, in the code base, in what has been written previously. So the least you want to try it. And at the beginning, it's exposing a lot of weaknesses. So I believe most people don't like it for that reason.
Absolutely. I've been teaching TDD for almost 25 years now, and I've encountered a lot of people who hate testing and even more who hate TDD. I have not yet encountered a single person who hated TDD and actually did it. Everyone who hates TDD says, I hate TDD because it makes you do this. And my answer is, no, it doesn't. Or I hate TDD because it causes that. No, it doesn't. I hate TDD because this. And everyone is talking shit when they say, I tried TDD and I didn't like it. There's a really great article by Ron Jeffries called We Tried Baseball and We Didn't Like It. It's actually about adoption of Scrum, but it applies to a lot of things. This is very much We Tried Baseball and We Didn't Like It. It's you didn't actually try TDD. You saw the phrase test-driven development, read a paragraph about it, invented your own set of practices that you then called TDD that sucked, and then you said, I did TDD and didn't like it, except those people have almost never done TDD. I also think that when people experience pair programming, they like it too. It is exhausting. I would prefer to not pair, but I know that if I pair with somebody for half a day, for 4 hours, and just take for the morning and we both take the afternoon off, we will have accomplished more in that 4 hours of pairing than we would have both accomplished 8 hours solo each. And that is, first of all, that's counterintuitive. People think that pairing slows you down, but it actually speeds you up, and that's why I like it so much.
And it does relate to testing as well, right? Because one of the arguments of testing is, oh, I can't test because I'm doubling the amount of code, so I'm working twice, so I'm going to be slower, etc., etc., etc. Whereas we'll all agree that if you have a code base that is tested, no matter if you wrote it or not, you will work faster in that code base because you're less afraid, you will make less mistakes, you will have to fix less bugs, etc., etc., etc.
Let's pause here, because if you haven't written the test yourself or your team, or you do not have access to the person who wrote the test, might not be true. I think inheriting from a code base which is well tested, but you have no idea about the intentions behind the testing, the way it was tested, what was tested, why it was tested that way, it might be more difficult, because actually test is code. It's part of the code base, so there's more to maintain. There's some uniformity you have to maintain as well. And if you have no expertise at all about that code base, you might have a hard time maintaining the coherence of the test base. So I think it's not like a black and white situation. I think there are some shadowy zones. And most of the time, yes, I would definitely agree. But I'm very afraid about using words like always, never.
Yeah.
And you do raise a good point, that it will not always be like that. I was trying to exaggerate in the sense that in the end, if you have written tests, even though you have double the amount of work that you have done, quote unquote, double the amount, you will feel safer in your code, and then you will be able to make progress faster, right?
This is a common claim that people like to make, that you're doing twice as much work and blah, 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 blah. But in every other discipline, you will find things like this. Like in accounting, double entry accounting became the standard. And that's literally double the work. And in building trades, there's a saying that goes back hundreds of years: measure twice, cut once. Like, measure twice, cut once. Well, if you're not an experienced builder, you might look at this and say, why are people spending so much time measuring? If we spent less time measuring, we'd be able to get so much more work done. Well, but you're doing rework and you're causing issues. And that's what TDD is doing. It's preventing rework and it's preventing these issues from coming up in the first place. And so nobody in the building trade would say, let's cut corners on getting proper measurements and just start pre-cutting lumber. But in the software trade, for some reason, we say, oh yeah, let's just cut corners by not demonstrating that our software actually does what we think it does. I don't actually understand the logic behind that.
Yeah, and I think there's also like a big bias because, yes, you're writing twice the amount of words. That's probably true, maybe even more, because test tends to be verbose. But I don't think programming can be measured as how many words you're writing. Most of the time, if you're really a good programmer, you're actually writing terser, like more dense and fewer words. So it does not matter that you have to write twice the amount of words. It does not matter at all. Like, I cannot write code at the speed that I'm writing Slack messages. Otherwise, like, most programs would be like completed in less than a week. So it does not matter how many words you're writing. What matters is how you're articulating ideas and commands and queries and concepts. Naming things takes forever, but look at how much time you're saving when you find a proper word.
Yeah, absolutely. The other thing that I like to think about and remind myself is that when I'm doing TDD, I actually write a lot less code in total. The test and the production code is less than I would have written for a number of reasons. First of all, refactoring is an integral part of TDD. And so after I've written a test, I've written some code to make it pass, now I'm going to refactor that code mercilessly to make it smaller and more readable and less wordy and less verbose. And also, when I have a comprehensive test suite that passes, I already know that, hey, my software actually does all of these things and it doesn't need to do any more. I'm done now. I don't have to write any more code. And so I find myself, when I'm doing TDD, I find myself writing a lot less code for edge cases and what about this and what about that and all the shit that's never possibly going to happen. But I would have written code for it anyway, just in case. So I find that TDD is more efficient that way as well.
Yeah, it's a bit like if you're doing releases often enough, you will actually have less feature as a total, but you will have exactly, quote unquote, exactly what you need, right? If you're using tests to guide your flow, it will be the same that I have less code or probably less code, but I have the code I need.
Yes, and it's funny because you just mentioned that refactoring is part of the loop, right? Like red, green refactor, it's part of the initial loop. Interestingly, it also makes you practice refactoring. So you get good at refactoring, which means that you also get good at the refactoring that you cannot do in the loop because there's an organic growth of the code base. So even though you're doing that red, green refactor, there's some stuff that gets like added over like longer amount of time. But if you're good at refactoring because you're doing it all the time, you also get good at refactoring those organic growth.
Yeah, absolutely. And another thing that I think is important before we're done is that I have a lot of very strong opinions about this, and some of it sounds like dogmatism, but my opinions about this are not necessarily things that I expect every team to do all the time. I have one terrible opinion in particular that people fucking hate, that I'm not able to follow myself all the time, but I have an opinion that a unit test is only a unit test if it only has one concrete instantiation, which is the unit under test. And so if you are testing your article model in your Rails class, then the only thing you're allowed to new up is an article. Everything else needs to be a mock or a stub. And you should probably also fake the database to make it nice and fast. Do I do this every time? Fuck no. But I think that it's important to know what are the ideals so that we know what are the compromises that we're making along the way. And I don't want being in search of the ideal to be seen as dogmatism. I want it to be seen as constantly in search of the ideal, because the closer we can get to it, the better, obviously. And every project is different. I'm very happy to go into a team that has a test suite that takes 40 minutes or an hour and a half or however many. I think the longest one I've ever seen took overnight to run. And about half of it, we had to leave it running overnight for CI, and about half of it was not user interaction, like not acceptance level stuff. And you know what? When we shaved 3 hours off of that test suite time, boy, did we feel good. It's just kind of nice.
So you have to let it grow so you can feel good afterwards.
That's right. Yeah, let your test suites get fast. Yes, there's some pro advice. Let your test suites get really slow so that you can schedule some feel good time off in the future when you speed them up.
So basically what you're telling me is add a spec that basically says sleep 8 million and then periodically shave 20% of that sleep just so I can feel good, right?
Sure. I mean, some people like to lie to themselves and they feel good about that too. So that's totally fine. Look, do whatever makes you feel good, man. I'm well known on the internet and in my friend groups for saying some wild shit that just because it feels good to say some wild shit and to try out new ideas like a jacket and see how it fits. But I'm never going to get in the way of people doing what they want. I don't think people should use RSpec. They do. Cool. If you like it, do it. Although there are some things I miss in RSpec when I'm not using it that is bothering me a little bit because I have to patch them in.
Let's dig into that because I think both Philippe and I use RSpec, if I'm not mistaken, Philippe. Why do you think? Because I think if I would start today in a new application, I would try out a mini test. I think is the default Rails test. But why do you think you should not use RSpec? And Philippe, why do you think you should? Or if you think you should?
Okay, so there are 3 reasons why I don't think people should use RSpec. First of all, it's not default. And I think that if there is a default for something, you should use it until such point as not using that default is causing you a lot of pain. The second reason I think you shouldn't use RSpec is because it implements the XUnit pattern, which is portable. If you learn how to write tests using Minitest, using the XUnit pattern, which is what Minitest is, not the RSpec syntax for Minitest, but if you use the XUnit pattern in Ruby and you need to suddenly write some code in Kotlin tomorrow because your company is launching an Android app, well, you can go and apply the knowledge that you learned from the learning the XUnit pattern in Ruby to Kotlin. And you can use that to help you learn the new language because the pattern doesn't change. In RSpec, we have the describe it pattern. The describe it pattern doesn't translate between languages very well. Smalltalk can do it. Ruby can do it. JavaScript can't do it at all because there's all of that extra bullshit garbage syntax you have to learn. But it's the default in Jest. So that's the second reason, the pattern language. And the third reason is RSpec has gone beyond. I'm not happy with how RSpec Rails is today. I think that RSpec Rails has a bunch of opinions about request specs and what kinds of things go where and stuff that I just think are idiotic. So yeah, those are the 3 reasons why. Before Philippe tells everyone why they should use RSpec, I do want to jump in. There are a couple things that I really miss. One is, and I actually patched this into active support last night, I may open a pull request against Rails. You talked about typing out it and not putting the block on to make it a pending test. I wrote my own last night, so I overrode the test helper so that if I write test in a string without a block, it just adds a block with a skip using the test message. Because I like that. I like using the skip test as a to-do. So I actually patched that in, and I think I'll open a pull request against Rails for it. I miss contexts. You have to do a little bit more thinking, but I don't mind doing the thinking because XUnit pattern, your tests are classes and methods. So any of the, and this goes with the second reason, the XUnit pattern reason, any of the skills that you learn about cleaning up your test suite are skills that you've also learned about cleaning up your actual code because they're identical. The skills you learn to clean up a RSpec test suite are very different skills than the skills you apply to cleaning up a code base because RSpec is its own separate language and own separate beast. Also, Minitest mock, which I also created, is missing a few features that I've had to add, and now I will be pushing those upstream as well. So, Philippe, why am I wrong?
It's quite tough, like going after you. First of all, where are you definitely right? Learn the default. That's always true. Like learn the default. It's a default for a reason, and definitely like pick something else only if the default does not fit you, whatever your reason, but learn the default. It's always a good rule of thumb. There's a high chance that you have to work with other people and they will know about the default. Now, my personal history is that I learned XUnit because I was doing Java in college. This is where I started. And at that time, I was not really good at writing tests because I had a course about testing, and basically it was like learn the API, learn the tools. It was not at all about how do you write tests. It was like what matches exist in JUnit. So I was not good at it. Then I did not use it because I started Ruby. I was not writing tests. Then at some point I believed in tests for reasons like XP and stuff like that. So it took me a year, I would say, getting comfortable by myself with testing. And I tried Minitest and I did not like it. And at that point, at that age, RSpec brought a lot of novelties. Now, I must say that I don't like everything RSpec brings, but it felt more advanced. It gave me more options. So I pick a set of stuff on RSpec which I like. I added a few conventions, like my own conventions, which eventually became my team conventions. I'm using passive voice or active voice in a meaningful way, stuff like that. So eventually, like RSpec felt like clay, and Ruby overall feels like clay. When Python and Java feels like Lego bricks, Ruby is clay. I can like shape it in whatever thing I want. And RSpec brought me that. So I actually don't know if RSpec is better. I would not advise people going with RSpec. I think you can live your life with RSpec. I think it has every tool you may need to do whatever you may want. The thing that it does not have very easy to do by yourself. I just don't know what modern Minitest looks like. So maybe it's the same. Try both, but start with Minitest because it's the default.
You both mentioned Minitest being the default, which is absolutely true. But I feel like RSpec is an unofficial default. Like I've not seen any code base that I've worked on professionally. It's not a lot, granted, it's like 3 or 4, but none of them had Minitest. Like everything I've seen in the wild is RSpec.
I was just going to point that out because I noticed this yesterday. So the project for the online music lessons, the reason it has RSpec is because my colleague who was going to work on it with me, although she ended up not working on it as much and focusing more on design stuff, said, well, every time I look for documentation, the documentation is in RSpec. Or like a blog post or whatever, it's always RSpec. And I said, okay, well, maybe don't rely on reading blog posts and just actually learn how, like if you learn the foundational stuff, then we don't have to go Googling. But as I was going through the other day, porting over the test suite from RSpec back to Minitest because I just like it better, and also because I have some stuff I want to do, I got to the point where I was moving my policy tests for Pundit over. Pundit ships RSpec helpers, and it doesn't ship helpers for the default, which is Minitest. They have a gist that they link to that says, here, copy and paste this into your test helper, and now you can write your tests for your Pundit policies a little bit easier. And I was like, and it really felt like they were telling me to fuck off. It was really disheartening because I wanted to see like shoulda matchers and factory bot and all that other garbage that everybody uses. I also use that garbage and I'm getting away from it. I'm currently also exercising factory bot out of my projects and going back to using bare fixtures for many of the reasons why I don't use RSpec. But yeah, it really is. RSpec became the default, like the de facto standard. Everyone uses it. It's on all of the projects at my day job. It's on, honestly, if I'm being 100% honest, every project I've ever worked on professionally that I didn't start uses RSpec. If I wasn't the first programmer there, it uses RSpec, which is ironic, but actually Philippe made a good point. He mentioned that for him, he adopted RSpec when he was learning TDD and XUnit didn't stick. That is why RSpec exists. RSpec existed as a teaching tool to get people test infected. So that was its purpose. I still don't think people should continue using it. I do wish that we would just build better testing tools on Minitest, but I guess that's my job now.
I think it would be nice, if you can dream, if Ruby itself had like an official standard in a standard lib and a commitment to say, okay, this is the official stuff. Maybe Mats and his team can actually gather like people from Minitest and from RSpec and say, okay, now how do we handle this? Because it feels like RSpec is a little bit like active support, kind of preliminary experiments of what might end up in standard lib if it works well. So maybe now it's time to just grab the nice bits of RSpec and put them in Minitest.
Well, so Minitest is the default. It's only shipped as a separate gem because all of the standard library in Ruby has been moved out to gems. So prior to Minitest, it was Test Unit, written by Nathaniel Talbot. And Test Unit went away and Minitest became the thing. And it was a drop-in replacement. You can still, if you had a test suite that was written for Test Unit, it'll work with Minitest. So I would say Minitest is default, and Minitest does include Minitest spec, which has context and describe and most of the things that people really like about RSpec, but it's not API compatible for matchers. So like if you use Minitest spec, you get RSpec syntax, but you don't get like the pundit custom matchers or the shoulda stuff prop in the way that they intend it for RSpec. You have to use the XUnit version. So there are some things there. I think that one of the things, I don't really care about a lot of this that you mentioned, active support. I don't really care about a lot of the stuff that's in active support. I find that I use const get more often than I use constantize, for instance. But one of the things that I definitely always add to Minitest when I'm not in Rails is the test method helper, where you can write test and pass it a string and a block. I always just add my own because I think it's excellent. So yeah, I would start using RSpec if Rails would make RSpec default. And I actually think that Rails did kind of miss the boat on that. I don't like RSpec better, but I still think it should probably be the default in Rails. Because in the history of Rails, that's what happens. Every time we get to a situation where everyone is using the same thing, we just embed that thing. And that becomes the standard. And so, yeah, I do think that Rails probably around Rails 4, probably should have adopted RSpec as default. Even though I also wouldn't do it if I was in charge of Rails, but I find it odd that it is the one de facto default that didn't make it into Rails, if that makes sense.
It makes sense. I think I'm looking now at the clock and we're getting close to the allotted time. But I'm going to try to ask you for a couple of do's and do nots of testing. Will be a bit of a recap of what you have said, which was the whole episode. But if you're talking to someone that has no experience about tests, a couple of do and do nots so they can get started in their testing journey, right?
Do write tests for business logic. Start with that. Do not start with like system spec. That shit gets a lot of setup. Business logic is important, does not require any setup, will make you happy because that's typically what grows and grows, so you want to add cases. So yeah, do start with business logic.
Yeah, I'm going to piggyback on that one. If you have a project that you want to bring under test, definitely focus on the business logic. And I would say narrow that down further and focus on the things that are most likely to change often. So where your highest churn is and where the bugs are most often fixed. And you can find that information in your bug tracker. And the other one that I think is super important is, and this is where RSpec comes from and why it exists, testing TDD is about describing the behavior that your software will have. And so you should keep that in mind when you're writing your tests. That's how you should write your tests. Your test should be a description of what the software does when it's working. And I think if people follow that advice, everything else just sort of falls into place.
Okay, more? You want more? I have 2 more.
Of course I want more.
I'm going to be quicker. Do not introduce randomness in your test. make them always the same. Like you do not want any form of randomness. And if you're starting, do find someone with some experience, some opinions, because it's highly opinionated topic. So either someone in your professional team, and if there's nobody in your professional team, then start maybe contributing to an open source software. Try to pair with someone who has experience before trying to do it on your own professionally.
As someone that started testing on his own and basically learned testing on his own, I can second that. Learning on your own testing is going to be a pain.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with those. And then I guess the last one that I would like is to point out, and this sort of applies to everything, not just testing, but in the software industry, we are incredibly bad at remembering where things came from and why they exist. And as a result, getting them wrong. And so I would just, if you want to learn about TDD, go and read the original XP and TDD books by Kent Beck. In my circle of friends, we call him Kent fucking Beck. And if you want to learn about, just like if you want to learn about Ruby, it's fine to go back and read a Ruby book from 20 years ago because everything new is additive, right? If people are looking for learning a new skill, first ask why that skill exists, right? Why does you will learn more about Ruby by asking why does Ruby exist and why do people like it than you will by going and learning all of the syntax. And you will learn more about TDD by asking, why do people write their tests first? Why do people enjoy this? Why does it result in better software? And going back to the original sort of documents explaining that stuff, asking why is way more important than figuring out how. How comes from that. So that would be sort of my overall advice for everyone. Definitely just continually ask why.
Absolutely. And how changes also. Like I'm thinking about the RSpec book, which I read, the version that still has it should, blah, 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 blah. Like this has changed, but the book is still very valid. And read also, like if I can add more, because more generic, read code, test is code, read code. It's fucking stupid how most programmers are like, oh, you're told how to write code, then you write code, you write code, you write code. But we're the only writers that do that. Like most writers, if you're a journalist, you read journals. If you're a poet, you read poetry. If you're like a novel writer, you read novels. We have to read in order to tune our craft. And as Ruby developers, we're very lucky because it's an interpreted language. So all the gems, we can actually open them and have a look at them. So if you want to start a new craft, if you want to learn how to write, test, then read test. Actually, go read the test of all the awesome gems you're using every day.
Right. And with that, I think we can bring the episode to a close. Thank you both so much. It was a really, really interesting episode. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you.
Thank you.